All right, hello again. So in this video, we're going to go over some tools, guidelines, tips, ideas, concepts, stuff about framing and composition. And this is sort of the first part of this. So these are some of the things that we're going to talk about in this series. It's going to be more than one video, I believe. So framing an image, how do you actually point the camera in the place that works, right? How do you choose what you're going to photograph and come up with a pleasing composition? And when I say composition, I should kind of define that for you. When I'm talking about composition, we're talking about like what's in the frame and where is it in the frame. So that's you're composing something. You're putting some elements together inside of an image, basically. With photography, we're doing that by pointing a camera somewhere. In painting, we're talking about having a canvas that we arrange things on. So lots of ways to think about composition and framing, but basically it's what's in the frame and where is it, and how big is it, and things like that. So framing an image, that's obviously an important part of it. The rule of thirds, which is sort of a guideline or a little helper guideline that will help you maybe create some more pleasing compositions and balance them and that kind of thing. Leading lines, which is basically using lines within an image or to sort of guide the viewer's eyes around the image or direct attention to an important part of the image. Frame within a frame refers to technique where you kind of have a subject that is framed by some foreground element. Maybe you're looking through something to something else, like a window, for example. Looking through a window to some scene outside, that would sort of be a frame within a frame. Symmetry is talking about sort of a balance between the left and right side or the top and bottom of an image. It can be literally balanced, like it's the same on both sides, or it can have asymmetric symmetry where it is sort of a balance of visual weight or important elements on both sides of an image. We'll look at that eventually as well. Horizontal versus vertical. You can always turn your camera. Well, not always, but most of the time you can turn your camera horizontal or vertical. And most cameras have a rectangular aspect ratio, which is the next topic, right? But that changes obviously what's going to be in the frame. So we'll talk about that eventually. Aspect ratios, which is a fancy way of saying the shape of the frame. Is it a square? Is it a 2:3 ratio? Is it a 3:4 ratio? All these are different shapes of squares and rectangles, basically. But they do have different properties as far as how you can compose the image, what's in the frame and what's out of it. We'll talk about angles, angles in the image, diagonals in the image, but also the literal angle of the image itself, and then more if things come up. So in this little part, this first part here, we're going to talk about framing an image and the rule of thirds. And a lot of these elements and these ideas will be present in more than one image, or the same image will have more than one of these going on. So we'll jump back and forth through these a little bit too as we talk about them. So here we've got talking about framing an image. When you frame an image, you're choosing what the viewer sees, right? So if I am a photographer, I'm the photographer and I'm in this location, just by pointing the camera somewhere, I am deciding what I think is making an interesting image, perhaps, right? But I'm also choosing for the viewer. The viewer can only see what I show them in that rectangle, right? Obviously, there's more. If I was actually there, I could turn around, I could point, I could look down, I could look up, I could look around. I can turn around, right? All those things, and I can see different things. And when we're at an actual location, when we're in real life, that's how we look. We kind of scan around, or our eyes zips around all around a frame or all around a scene, and we see different things, and we kind of add it all together to get a perception of that location. With a photograph, right, this is cut off. I'm looking through basically a little hole at reality or what the scene was, right? I can't see outside the frame, right? It's hidden from me as a viewer. So in this case, is this a beautiful tree in a natural setting? What's the story of this image? Is this a forest out in nature, right? And we're just walking through the forest and we see this tree and with this sort of wispy clouds above it. But by changing that composition, by basically backing up a little bit or zooming out a little bit, Now we have a completely different image. Okay, now we still see the image, we still see the sky, but now we see this sort of street, sort of urban setting, and there's lots of cement, and there's lines on there's sidewalks and cars and all that sort of urban stuff, right? So now this is sort of is this like a lonely tree kind of in an urban setting? Is that what this is about? It's very dead center, so it's probably prominent in this, it's very prominent in this composition, sort of dead center bullseye framing, as I sometimes call it. So it's sort of featured, right? But that's still the subject, but there's a lot of other information in here that is telling us things, right, as a viewer. And as the photographer, by showing that, you are saying you're communicating different things. So here, just by moving a couple of feet to the left and getting lower, we see this big dumpster in the fore, and it's very large, right? Because of the wide angle lens, it's large. It's got a little distortion to it. It's large in the frame. The tree gets quite a bit smaller. Well, a little bit smaller, right? But it's still there. That looks basically, essentially like that first image, right? But now we're seeing other things, right? So now is this about? It's not really about nature. It could be, right? But it's something to do with nature in urban. Maybe it's urban decay or pollution or recycle. Could be about a lot of things. And that's the viewer's prerogative too, is to how they interpret your image. They see elements, they see focal points, they see important elements: the tree, the sky, and this dumpster probably in this one. And they make up a story sometimes about it, some sort of narrative, right? So, or a theme, right? If you want to think of it that way. So, but just by small changes, right? I think I barely moved on these, a little bit, but not a whole lot. But I did change the framing. I changed where the camera was pointed. I changed the focal length a little bit to show more or less of the scene, right? And then you're going to get this different result. So that's kind of what I'd like to get across is these little changes in the framing, in your composition, can make big differences. So here again, so we see these three different images. They're from the same position, they're same time of day, same camera, obviously same lens, although I think this is wider angle. But pointed down or backing up a little bit, zooming out a little bit, but getting even lower towards the ground, below this dumpster, and making it sort of look tall and foreboding and dark in the foreground. That changes the message quite a bit, right? And again, the viewer doesn't know what's outside of your field of view. You're choosing for them, pretty much. Here's another example. So we've got, this is the top of a bridge, and some blue sky, right? And then here, and in this case, it's kind of filling up about 2/3 of the frame. So there's less of this sort of empty blue sky. Here, the part of the bridge is filling up maybe, what is that, like 1/3 or 1/4 even of the frame. And then most of the frame is this sort of blue gradient in the sky with a couple of wispy clouds and things like that. So much different, right? So this one has more information, more visual information in it, if you want to think of it that way. It has a lot of detail, right? Generally, a viewer's eye is going to be attracted by that detail. They're going to say, "Oh, look at those rivets," and they don't literally think that, but that's what they end up looking at. Most people are going to look at this area of the frame versus this area, but this area is still important. So you're looking at these rivets and the metal and the ladder and all this sort of industrial stuff, right? Heavy machinery kind of thing. And then here, you got the same thing, but it's less of it, and then you've got a lot more open space, a lot more breathing room. This one could be even this one can have more tension, right? It's got all this hard-edged, mechanical, man-made stuff in it. This one's got a lot of space, literally space in it, negative space, empty space, right? It's not literally empty, but pretty close. So a different effect. Just a slight change. No position change, no lens change, no timing, nothing. Just like a couple of degrees change of what you put in the frame makes a big difference. Here's another example. So this is kind of about filling the frame. You may hear people talk about, or other people talk about filling the frame. So sometimes photographers, when they start out, or in general, they might have a tendency to be a little far back, a little bit unfocused in what they're kind of showing in the composition or in the frame. And so it can kind of lack a central character or a central Focal point is another term that you'll hear, right? So here we've got the shot of this scene, and there's a car. There's cars, and there's a mountain, and a sidewalk or a crosswalk, and this interesting character guy riding a bike here, and a street light, and a walk signal, right? Lots of stuff in there, but it doesn't have. I mean, he could be the central, character or the point of interest, the focal point of this image, but he's kind of small in the frame. Here, this is the same shot, just cropped. So you can crop to change your framing as well. And so if you are going to do, that is a good reason to maybe shoot a larger images in general, because you can go back and crop after the fact. If you have a small image and you crop, then you may have a small image. Is what I mean by that is not a lot of pixels, right? So say if this was 1,000 pixels across, if I crop to that size, it's going to be 500 pixels maybe, because it's about half. And then maybe I don't have enough detail there. I don't have enough pixels or enough detail or information in there, and it starts to look soft and low quality. So a larger image can help with this sort of post composition. You want to think about it that way. Composing after the fact, right? Little side note on that too, there was a trend, and there still is. Some photographers will, when they shoot film, they used to show the edge of the film. Literally in the print of the film, they would show the edge of the film. And I know a lot of you guys have never used film, but it was a thing back in the day. But the point of that, part of the point of that was to show, like, this is what I saw. This is what was in the camera. This is what the image was. It hasn't been cropped. It hasn't been changed. It hasn't been manipulated as far as crop goes. Not saying you can't do that. So that's what I've done here, actually. So here I took this image and cropped it. So now this interesting character, right, is now much more prominent in the frame. He's literally larger in the frame. All this stuff is cropped out because maybe it's not important. So filling the frame means leaving out what's not important, or in whatever you decide is not important. Let's think of it that way too. This image also includes a little bit of juxtaposition. So that's another term that I'll use, and you should think about is basically putting two things together in a composition, or two or more, and sort of getting a third sort of meaning out of it that changes because of the inclusions of something else. So if I were to crop just around this person, it would be one image, right? But here I've included the red hand on the walk signal and this pole here. It kind of balances him out too as far as visual weight. So at least for me anyway, this is all open to interpretation, right? But so he's, kind of a central figure, but then there's this bright red hand, and it's kind of on the opposite side of the frame, and it's telling him to stop, or telling me to stop, I guess. But that's juxtaposition, sort of putting two things near each other or in the same composition, and then you get a new meaning because of that. So the next thing we're talking about is filling the frame in portraits. So you will hear me say this. You'll hear a lot of people say this. Fill the frame when you're shooting portraits. What does that mean? That means basically get closer. A lot of times you'll hear it referred to as just getting closer. And here's sort of an example of that. So here's an image of three women, right? They're in a beautiful location with the Golden Gate Bridge there. And they're obviously got some bikes, and there's another person over here, right? So it's an okay image, it's a viable image. But here is the same scene, but if you get closer, right? And then you sort of crop out, but you're not really cropping, but you're selectively pointing the camera so that you're not seeing all this other stuff in there, right? Maybe it's a distraction, right? You're not seeing this person, you're not seeing these bikes. You can still include, although I just noticed this woman back here. You could Photoshop her out if you wanted to, but we'll get to that later maybe. But I literally just noticed that woman right there. I didn't even see that. Now I do. But the Golden Gate Bridge is in the background. So you can still include backgrounds and still be tight on the shot. But generally a good rule of thumb or sort of tip is on compositions for portraits is to get closer and sort of fill the frame with the subject. If they are the subject, right? If they're not, if you need to show the scene, like, oh, okay, I want to see more of the bridge, I want to see that they're riding bikes, that if that's part of the story, then show that, right? But it's kind of like what part of the story, what part of the narrative are you trying to show? So Another tip is the rule of thirds. Place objects and focal points along lines created by dividing the image into thirds, horizontally and vertically. What does that mean? Well, so here's a little image of my friend's dog, and I think the dog is going to heaven. No, I don't know. Stay away from the light, I guess. But if I go show these dividing lines here, then you can kind of see that this dog is sort of at the on this line here. So this is a rule of thirds sort of guide. This is literally a shot from the or a screenshot from the crop tool in Photoshop or Lightroom. I can't remember. But if you use the crop tool in a lot of tools that work with photographs, they will literally show you this 9-cell sort of pattern with 2 horizontal lines and 2 vertical lines. And that is literally to help you sort of, if you want, place focal points or subjects or important objects or whatever you want to think, however you want to think about it, along these lines. And that could be sort of a pleasing composition, as opposed to putting it, somewhere else in the dead center or something like that. So here, this little dog is along this line here. You can also turn on this grid in your viewfinder on a lot of cameras. It's usually off by default because it could be a little distracting, right? You don't want to see these lines all the time, but you can turn it on often on DSLRs and other cameras, and that's also there to help you sort of compose your shot while you're doing it, right? So if you see these lines while you're shooting, you're like, oh, I'm going to put this, I'm going to use this rule of thirds sort of thing, and I'm going to put some important focal point or my subject. So if it's a portrait, for example, you could put the eyes there or a person's head there, right? Along this line. So that kind of thing. Or if it's a landscape, you can put the landscape down here, or you can put the landscape up there. So those lines can be used a lot. You don't have to do this. This is just sort of a little helper thing, but yeah, it's often done. So here's an example. You can also put elements at the intersections of these lines. They can just be along the line, obviously, but you can also put them at intersections. So here we've got this subject, this person here, at the intersection of these 2 lines. And also the top of this bridge is kind of across this top line third here. And then the right side of the bridge is along that this line here, and then you've got a sky here. Now you could recrop this and change it so that it didn't fit along those lines, and that would be up to you, but that is a possibility. Another thing on this one is that I noticed was this image might work okay as a square. So think about just taking off these top 3 sections, and now we've got a square. I think it's pretty much square. But that goes to aspect ratio. That's the shape of the frame, which also can have ramifications on your, the feel and the energy in your frame. Sometimes squares are hard to make dynamic because they don't really have a direction as much. They're kind of static, this square shape. Here is another composition on this same exact scene, same subject, same scene, basically, right? But this is more bullseye or centered framing. This might be what you might see, people have a tendency to do when they first start, not always, but when they first start in photography. And that is to put the focal point or the important part of the image at the dead center. That can be a little bit static. It can be a little bit low energy. It can also work. Doesn't mean you can't do it. It definitely focuses attention here. Also because this one has some leading lines, which we'll talk about later in a different video, I think. But these lines here kind of lead to that subject, right? But it can definitely work, and it definitely says to the viewer, oh, you should be looking at this. That's what bullseye framing does sometimes. Especially so if, I don't have this image, but say he was turned around and facing us and staring at the camera, right? Then it becomes sort of confrontational, like, oh, he's looking right at us and he's right in the middle of the frame and what's going on? I feel bad, right? So they can be different, they can have a different effect whether it's in the middle of the frame or, along these rule of thirds lines. Sort of related to that, similar to the rule of thirds, is something called, it's not really related as far as, concept, but it has a similar effect. It's called the golden rate. Goes by a lot of names, a lot of aliases. The golden ratio, the golden section, the Fibonacci numbers or number, even the divine proportion. So this is a ratio if it's about 1.618 something to 1. And what it's close to 1/3 or 2/3, if you want to think of it that way. So that's it. That's a number that supposedly appears in nature a lot. It appears in art a lot. It appears in painting and architecture, the Parthenon, lots of classical painting, Da Vinci's works by Da Vinci, photography everywhere. So I just looked up golden section in photography, and I got, these are the first 16 images that came up in just a Google search. And you can see it's often represented by this golden spiral. Some people call it the golden spiral. And if you look, it's hard to see a little bit, but let's see, maybe on this one. Each one of these areas is using that ratio. So this is 1.6 times as big as that one, I think, and then the next one and so on. So it gets larger and larger. These areas get larger and larger. And you'll often see this spiral sort of overlaid on photographs. Now, I would bet you that none or very few of the photographers who took these images actually were thinking like, oh, I'm going to use the golden ratio on this photograph. Maybe they did. Even Ansel Adams. This is Ansel Adams down here. Maybe. Possible. But it's not really super practical to think in these sort of ratios, when you're actually shooting. Think about how photography is different than painting, for example. I mentioned painting down here, right? With photography, a lot of times you don't have control over what is in front of the camera. You do sometimes if you set up the shot. But if you're doing a landscape, I'm not going to move this mountain, right? I can move myself, but you have some limitations as far as what is in front of the camera. Now, there are exceptions to that. So if you think about like an Annie Leibovitz cover for Vanity Fair, she uses a lot of, supposedly, uses a lot of classical composition techniques, and she can place people exactly where she wants them so that they sort of fall into these compositional techniques. But a lot of times you don't have that option, right? And if you can see in these examples, most of these examples just have some sort of focal point at this center of the spiral here, and you can manipulate that however you want. I don't even see how these apply to some of these, maybe, but I guess I'm sort of throwing a little bit of cold water on the golden section in photography, but it definitely, and it's close to, if you look, this is close to like a third of the way across, so that's kind of the rule of thirds as well, both of them. I thought that'd be funny maybe illustrative. I just applied the golden section or the golden spiral over that image that we looked at earlier. And look, subconsciously, I did a perfect divine proportion on here. Not really. I wasn't even thinking about that. I just happened to shoot it that way. Kind of rule of thirds a little bit, but ended up being at that focal point of the spiral, of this golden spiral. So I will link for you guys. Hopefully it'll still be there by the time you see this. There's a good article by a mathematician / photographer, I think, who says that this whole idea of the golden ratio is overblown, and that it's an example of confirmation bias, which basically says you tend to see things that you expect to see or you want to see. So I expected to see, this image fit the golden ratio or the golden section, and it did, so because I put it on the top. So anyway, take that with a grain of salt. But but that is something that you might hear about, the golden section, the golden ratio, in various guides, on composition for photography and other art forms as well. So that kind of ends this little section of our ideas on framing and composition. Hopefully that was helpful a little bit, and I will talk to you again later.